Good morning. My name is Rich Castle, and I direct the Clean Energy and Sustainability team at Capalino. Today's webinar is the latest in our Future of New York series. It's a series that's unfolded over the past year as we've all collectively thought about how do we want our city, our state, and our region to grow and prosper as we look to the future. Today, we're thrilled to partner with the Waterfront Alliance to discuss the topic of coastal and waterfront resiliency at a moment of accelerating climate impacts and a moment of critical infrastructure investment needs. I'd like to take a moment to frame the conversation before we get started. Nearly 9 years after Hurricane Sandy, this summer's Hurricane Ida reminded us of our vulnerability to severe coastal storms and of the need to plan and invest in ways that will make New York more resilient. But even without Hurricane Ida to remind us, there are many reasons why increasing our resiliency is especially important right now, and I'll focus on just two. First, in August, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warned that we can expect once-a-century extreme sea level rise events to happen every year by the end of this century, unless we reduce emissions enough to avoid the most serious climate impacts. Second, all of these impacts cost money. Storm-related damage costs are accelerating. Since 1980, the US economy has suffered nearly $2 trillion in weather-related costs. Nearly half of that has been in just the last 10 years. And in fact, last year, 2020, set a record for the most billion-dollar storms, with 22 storms totaling more than $95 billion in damages. Now, in other webinars that we posted, we've talked about nation-leading steps that New York City and state are taking to reduce emissions in the future. That's not today's conversation, though. Today's conversation is about the importance of investing in adaptation and mitigation strategies to increase our resiliency and reduce the impacts of climate change that's already baked into the system. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists and move into the program. What we'll do is, you've seen this before, we'll have introductory remarks from each of the panelists, and then we'll have a conversation that I'll moderate. During the last 15 minutes or so of our hour together, we'll take questions from the audience. The chat feature is disabled, but you can put your questions in the Q&A function. Works like every other Zoom webinar you've ever done. And if you type them into the Q&A, we'll do our best to get to all the questions. So today you're going to hear from Courtney Worrell of the Waterfront Alliance, John Boulay from Dewberry, and then Sally LeBreur of HNTB. Courtney is the president and CEO of the Waterfront Alliance. Among other accomplishments, she's played a major role in the development of the 2020 New York City Comprehensive Waterfront Plan, and she launched the award-winning Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines, or WEDGE program, for the New York-New Jersey Harbor. John is a senior vice president at Dewberry, and he specializes in resilience, risk mitigation, water resources, environmental restoration, infrastructure, and facility services. He's a retired U.S. Army colonel. In his last post, he was commander of the New York District of the Army Corps of Engineers. And Sally is vice president and practice leader for rail and transit for the New York-New Jersey region at HNTB. As the former senior vice president for subways at New York City Transit, Sally helped lead the MTA through many significant weather events, including Hurricane Irene and Superstorm Sandy. So without further ado, we'll start with Courtney for some introductory remarks. We'll go to John, and then we'll go to Sally, and then we'll go to the conversation. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Rich. Thanks, everyone. And I think my introductory remarks are going to be describing a little bit about why the Waterfront Alliance exists and what we do. So the Waterfront Alliance was established as a spinoff from the Municipal Arts Society. And that was at a time when around 2006, 2007, when the city was still experiencing its transition from an industrial waterfront to what should be a world-class waterfront. And that post-industrial phase was really something that needed to have an independent voice and an independent organization looking at how that transition would happen. Would we have all luxury high-rise condominiums, or would we have, for our waterfront and coastlines, this mix of heterogeneous uses, everything from waterfront to waterfront parks to industry, ports, definitely residential developments, but everything in between that might make up and should be part of a world-class city and world-class New York City. There are 520 miles of waterfront in New York City alone, just in the 5 boroughs. So that's a distance from here to North Carolina. That's a very, very long amount of waterfront and coastline that really needs the attention that it has been getting. One thing, though, that has been just ultimately clear in the last several years, and even more so in the last 2 years, is the devastating potential effects of climate change and the climate crisis. And that is why the Waterfront Alliance is working so hard on climate resilience in so many ways. So I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. And I think one point I want to make, and maybe we can talk about later, is just how important it is to put the efforts to reduce and eliminate the burning of fossil fuels on equal footing with preparing for the effects of climate change, which Rich did mention are baked into the system right now, and will be. So I can talk about that in a bit, but I think that this is a really important webinar and really happy to be able to get the chance to talk about all this. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Courtney. I'll just jump right in, Rich. John Boulay again from Dewberry, and got the pleasure of being part of Dewberry, a professional services firm focused on traditional engineering and architecture, but also specializing in resilience planning, risk and vulnerability assessment, community and asset scale resilience solutions. And I had the privilege of leading the Army Corps of Engineers from 2009 to 2012 in New York, and being involved in the execution of some large scale flood resilience projects, both on the coast and in various rivers around the New York metro area. I think for my remarks, I'd like to make a few comments that might help shape the discussion. My first comment would be, I believe we are only incrementally in better shape in terms of flood resilience than we were before Sandy. I think we have a long way to go. We've made some headway in planning and engineering, but my second point is going to be resilience is really about ribbon cuttings. We really need to construct the projects that are going to be necessary to reduce risk to our various communities, and we have not done that in any major scale since Sandy. So we got some work to do. My second point, Rich, something you said, we saw Ida in August in an intense precipitation storm. So, when Sandy came, it was a surge issue. Now we know we have to not only deal with issues that are related directly to the waterfront, but when you have intense precipitation, you might be some distance from the waterfront, but you might be at serious risk. And I'm sure Sally's going to talk about that when she talks about the subway system, and I'll leave that up to her. But this idea of wrestling with intense precipitation at various places that are some distance from the waterfront is something we need to get our heads around also. The third point I'd make is this is a problem that New York State and New York City must collaborate on to find the right solutions. And as we know, the state and the city collaborating can be a challenge, but it's absolutely a necessary part of finding the right solutions. And I think my last point for some discussion would be the absolute necessity to engage the communities that are impacted by these projects actively throughout the planning engineering and implementation of all resilience projects. That's not a nice to do, that's a must do. And I think that all those who are involved in project development, project execution, including the sponsors of those, must take that approach in order to get it done right. So I'll stop there, Rich, and turn it over to Sally for her remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Sally, all yours.
Yes, thanks. Thank you, John, and good morning to all who are listening. It's a pleasure to join this panel and to be a part of this discussion. So as Rich mentioned, I lead HNTB's transit and rail practice in the New York area, and I also formerly ran the New York City subway system. And I know that I join a wide community in stating how critically important our region's mass transit network is to the economic and environmental future of the city, the region, and beyond. And certainly, in my lifetime, it's just never felt like we are at a more critical juncture in terms of the need for good policy decisions, good investment decisions, good design decisions, ones that not only strengthen our infrastructure, but really support the vitality of our communities. The subway system was in many ways designed to take on water in New York City, right? A system of openings and underground caverns. It's perfect for catching and routing water. Now, even on a dry day, the New York City subway system pumps 13 million gallons of water through a series of pump rooms and pretty intensive drainage infrastructure. But tidal surge, like we saw with Sandy, and flash flooding, like we just saw with Ida, it demands something more than our system was designed to do 100 years ago. I agree with John that there's much more to do. I would say that the MTA and New Jersey Transit and PATH, they've done a tremendous amount of system hardening since Sandy. And HNTB has been involved in a lot of that engineering and a lot of the management of those improvements. Things like flood walls and storm doors, vent closures, designing and hardening critical equipment to withstand higher levels of flooding. City's been hard at work as well, ESCR being a notable key coastal resiliency initiative to protect our waterfront on the east side of Manhattan, and many intensive sewer and water management improvements throughout the city. But even as all of this work continues, the pressure continues to mount, right? And we need more and more solutions to move beyond just surge, as John mentioned, and manage flash flooding, right? Which we all know can strike very quickly and essentially anywhere in the system, and brings a lot of the same challenges as the surge level flooding. One thing, I completely agree with John's comments, this is not one agency's responsibility. It can't be solved with a single initiative. Water certainly knows no jurisdictional boundaries. It demands a collective response across agencies and requires focus not just on hardening, but understanding how water moves through our critical infrastructure and finding ways to absorb it and store more of it so that it can be effectively routed through our water management systems. And of course, all of this requires a broader environmental and climate focus, right? Our policies that incentivize and drive eco-friendly behavior. We all know that there can be a fair amount of opposition to resiliency efforts and policies. It may mean that we're losing parking or having tolled zones or losing street space to bus lanes, bike paths, pedestrian zones. A critical step in planning for the future is to engage our communities, as we just heard, not just in what the short-term impacts are, but what the broader vision is. And it doesn't mean that we back down from good policy decisions at the first sign of opposition, but we ensure that communities are heard, that decisions are well informed, and that the costs and benefits are examined from a short and a long-term perspective. I'll turn it back to you, Rich.
Great, thanks. So one of the great challenges of anything in the climate field and thinking about increasing our resiliency is certainly no different, is that we're making investments today and we're asking people in communities and businesses to make changes today to help protect against impacts that may be years, if not decades, off into the future. And that's always a hard thing to do. We're pretty good at responding to urgent crises. We're pretty good at saying, what do we need to do right now? And we use our tax dollars for things that we benefit from right now. We're less good at thinking about the future. So thinking about rebuilding back New York City, state, and the region better, post-pandemic, post-Sandy, post-Ida, what are some of the lessons that you're thinking about that are particularly relevant to how we make the case for investing now for a more resilient city looking forward into the future? And I want to do this through three lenses. So let's start with the built environment, housing, real estate, commercial, industrial, and so on. And then I'm going to ask about subways and infrastructure, and then we'll move to open space and parks. But let's see if we can take them one at a time. Open conversation, whoever wants to jump in, just go.
Okay, I'll jump in first. What the heck, somebody's got to be first, but Richard. But I would say the first thing I would say is what you're suggesting is counterculture to how Americans and how respond. I mean, how we look at disasters. Our traditional response is the disaster happens, we throw a bunch of money at it, and maybe we put some band-aids on some things, and then we go about our business till the next disaster happens, and then we throw more money at that particular disaster, and hopefully it doesn't happen in the same place. And so what we absolutely have to do is change that approach, and that's approach that comes from the federal government. It's essentially how the federal government responds, and that's changing. And I think Superstorm Sandy helped with that, and the way we approached, the government approached responding to that and looking more long term. The fact is that if you really look at the economic return on investment for mitigation, the studies show that for every dollar you spend on mitigation, you're able to save $4 in disaster repair. I mean, that's a pretty good return on investment. I mean, we're in the financial capital of the world, right? If you can make 4 to 1, you're doing pretty well, and that's essentially what we do. That's substantiated by, in fact, sometimes it's 6 to 1, by the way. 4 to 1's low. So I think there's the evidence to keep pushing the cultural change. So now looking through your three lenses, on the building side, I mean, I think in all three, I think what's really needed first is a good risk or vulnerability assessment. I'll tell you, there's never really going to be enough funds to do everything. So if you're an asset owner, you got to figure out what's most at risk and why, and you need to prioritize that. And so I think it's important that asset owners, whether it be a private organization or a public entity, really look at their assets and get help with that risk and that vulnerability assessment, looking at the risks that are most concerning to that organization, and then prioritize their investments based on that risk-based decision making, essentially. And then I think that you can look at solutions the same way. So if you look at an individual building, once you decide that that's a high risk asset, and then I'll let Sally and Courtney jump in with some other ideas. Then you look at solutions that are going to, again, reduce the risks to that particular asset, such that, the basic definition of resilience is the ability to bounce back. So that gets you a bigger bang, the ability to bounce back quicker to normal operations. And how you do that by things like where you put your electrical and mechanical equipment. Do you move it? Do you move it up, or do you decide to put a wall around your facility? And what are the benefit costs associated with that? And so I think that that's kind of the way you should approach it from that single asset standpoint. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'll add to what John said. So it's important also in terms of assets to look at your insurance and to work with your insurance broker specifically. What is your risk for flooding? What kind of coverage do you have? What kind of hazard coverage do you have? So there's just looking at that basic level. But I have to say that one area for growth for the city, and I think for across the country, is that we don't have enough consulting firms and enough people who are in the profession of really helping small businesses and medium-sized businesses with their asset protection. And so I think this is a huge area for growth, in fact, in terms of the economy and ways that the consulting industry can look at where their services are needed at a much smaller scale. A lot of the consulting firms are working on the large scale engineering projects, which they should be, and that's absolutely necessary, and exactly what John was saying before. There's a lot of ribbon cutting that's going to come, but also that depends a lot on federal funding that's going to be available. So what do we do in the meantime? The other thing I want to talk about just for a minute is the Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines program that the Waterfront Alliance has. So if you own waterfront property, or coastal property anywhere in the country, and you are considering redevelopment or retrofitting of any kind or new development, you can go through a process where your waterfront development can meet 3 standards. It can meet climate resilience standards, it can meet standards for community responsiveness, and it can meet standards for ecology. And if you go through the process, there's a verification that you can get that is similar to the LEED verification for energy efficiency. So those are some opportunities that are out there. And I guess the last thing I'll just say is that it's really important for businesses to understand what I was saying before, that, things aren't going to get better with the weather. So the weather we're having each year is the best weather we're going to have. Even if, we really need to stop burning fossil fuels. If we miraculously were able to do that tomorrow and not have massive disruptions, we'd still be facing decades, if not a century, of the Earth's response to the levels of carbon dioxide that we have in the atmosphere right now. So we must prepare for climate change, regardless of the trajectory for climate mitigation and our ability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. One last thing I'll just say is that the word mitigation is used in a million different ways, meaning opposite things. So if you hear mitigation, usually in these conversations, it means climate mitigation, reducing the greenhouse gas emissions that are going into the air. In other ways, mitigation can mean what you're providing if your project that you're working on the waterfront is doing damage to ecology, and you're mitigating for those effects by investment in wetlands restoration and other things. And then I think the insurance industry uses mitigation in a completely different way to actually have it apply wholly to climate adaptation. So just in case people are a little bit new to these kinds of conversations, that's one word to look out for, and just don't feel like you're dumb if you don't know what's being talked about when the word mitigation is being used.
It's a good set of clarifications, because we all live in worlds of a lot of jargon, and the same words get used in different ways when we jump from one silo to the next. So, Sally, I want to focus the next part of this conversation on transit and transit infrastructure. Obviously the MTA is in a critical moment of trying to figure out how do we get people back onto the system. We know that the office vacancy rates are still extremely high in Midtown, downtown, every commercial district of the city. You had bridge and tunnel crossings are back to normal. That's telling us that people are driving, they're not on the subway. And so I'm sure the folks who you used to work with at the MTA are very focused on how do we get people back onto the subway, into the buses and the trains. And when they're thinking about capital investments, they're thinking through that lens. But today's conversation is about climate adaptation and mitigation in its various forms. And so what insights or advice do you have to help shape how the MTA and others who are thinking about these issues should be thinking about resiliency-related investments to make sure that we are as prepared as we can be for future storms and climate risk?
Yeah, I think, thanks. I think that the infrastructure aspects of this discussion are certainly, specific to, what are the coordination mitigation efforts that can be put in place to do different things. But I also think that the transportation discussion here is no different than the community vibrancy discussion, and the question about how we support small businesses is absolutely linked to the subway ridership, right? So we know that the best thing that we can do to build subway ridership back up is to have our city operating the way that it was operating pre-pandemic, right? To have that level of vibrancy, to have that level of activity, to have that level of commerce happening. And that will certainly drive subway ridership, particularly given all of the efforts to, improve the reliability of the system and increase the cleanliness of the system. And all the enhanced security measures with additional cameras and police officers and the like. So it's a multi-pronged effort, but it's not one that is just specific to the transit network. And I think that that's also the power of it, right? Is that more people who are choosing transit we're contributing back. Yes, we have impacts that are baked in, but we're contributing back to the broader sort of eco-climate that we need to be building, which is to move away from fossil fuels and to move more folks into more sustainable modes of travel. In terms of the question that you started with, Rich, which is really around, how do you make the case for this immediately, right? I think we all understand that when we have unplanned flooding and we have to pay for those exorbitant damages, those can be unbearable for individuals or unbearable for businesses. And folks who have the opportunity to make choices will choose to start their business or choose to live in a place where they're not necessarily subject to those sorts of catastrophic events. And so that is the vibrancy of the communities. That is the vibrancy of the city. That is what drives more people here. That is why people want to draw from this diverse group of people to start their business or to build their business or grow their families, their communities. And so it's all linked together in terms of supporting the types of communities that are driven very much by small businesses, big businesses, and as diverse a group of people as New York has always been. And the transit network is absolutely part of that because it fosters all of that. It fosters density, it fosters clean energy. It brings about the kinds of spaces that people want to live in, they want to socialize in, they want to be in. But those are difficult arguments to make in the short term because those are difficult impacts to see in the very short term. I think in the short term, people want reliable transit, right? They want safe, reliable transit. And pre-COVID, the MTA had embarked on a historic capital improvement plan, unlike any they've ever put forward, to really fully modernize the system, to focus in on signaling, to focus in on accessibility, and really bring a lot of improvements to the system. And that is true across the board, particularly with all of the discussion around infrastructure spending. We are standing at a moment in time where we can start to see some real transformative investments in transit and transportation in this country. And the more that we have to account for the costs of these damages, just as John was mentioning, that means the less of those funds can go to things like newer stations and more elevators and newer, more modern, reliable systems. And it's beyond transit. It's certainly beyond the MTA. It's beyond transit. It's the infrastructure, certainly in New York City and elsewhere, is aging and needs investment to maintain its state of good repair and certainly to modernize and to expand. And we need to be able to prioritize those sorts of investments. So that means that we need to invest in the mitigation efforts that are required to head off to the greatest extent possible those unplanned damages and the expense of those damages, because they eat into those same things that people are looking for today. So that is a short-term compelling argument that if people want reliable systems, if people want, whether that's utilities of all sorts, we need to be able to invest in those resources now and deliver on that.
There's an interesting thread between what you're talking about and what John was talking about when he was talking about how asset managers have to think about risk. And I think it's that we need to be thinking in a multivariable way that's complicated. It's hard, right? So the prior debates about upgrading signals in the subway tunnels being about making sure the trains can run safely and reliably through the tunnels now becomes, it's also about how do you make those tunnels more resilient. Similarly, an asset owner who had an older building 5 or 10 years ago might have said, I'm going to switch from oil to natural gas in my heating and hot water because I want to reduce a particular type of emissions. I want to reduce some costs. Now is thinking, well, I need to be thinking about how do I upgrade my system, not just to improve my costs, not just to reduce my carbon emissions, which they will have to do under Local Law 97, but also how do I improve my resiliency? Because my prior thinking, which is I'm not near the water, so I'm okay, is now we learn from Ida, maybe not necessarily the case. And so we all have to be thinking in a much more multivariable way, which is both challenging, but also perhaps opens up some opportunities for creative innovation that we haven't seen before. That will be exciting as it unfolds. What we haven't talked about yet is the open space and parks issue, because that's the other piece here that's so important. We see not just in New York, but cities around the country, around the world, when they are making investments in waterfront resiliency, they're also rethinking the role of that space. And, early in my career, I was very involved in the creation of Hudson River Park. We didn't spend a lot of time thinking about storm surges or anything else related to resiliency when we were thinking about how do we just get that stretch of waterfront protected so people could ride, bike, picnic, and so on. Today, it's a very different way of thinking about it. So I don't know, Courtney, maybe you want to start on this one, but I think that it would be really interesting to think about the open space parks opportunities that come out of investing in greater resiliency.
Yes. Well, first of all, parks have a really interesting role to play in some places where they can be absorbers of stormwater, it's intense amounts of stormwater or storm surge. So they have the benefit of we have the benefit of using parks not only for recreation and the things we need on nice days, but potentially retrofitting them to be ways of protecting ourselves and protecting communities near them from the impacts of climate change. And so I know there's a lot of thinking going on right now about this. And if you've heard the term sponge park, that's a term that refers to this. And it's really exciting stuff. In fact, this multi-use of recreational facilities or recreational space has been employed in Europe, but also in parts of California. It's not brand new, but I think it requires a lot of investment and a lot of change. And we have to fund our New York City Parks Department, frankly, at much greater levels in order to reap these kind of benefits. The other thing I want to say, though, about waterfront parks is that they play a really important role on extreme heat days. And the reason for that is that the air is just cooler by the water, even on hot days. And part of it is that there's a breeze. And so one thing that we talk about is how we can retrofit, or we can modularize our parks so that we can close down some of the roads or arteries that are close to waterfront parks on high heat days, so that more community members can enjoy the fresh air and cooler air. We know we can do this because this is what happened during the pandemic. We had great numbers of people wanting to go out and enjoy the outdoors because that's where it was safe, and they were cooped up in their apartments. And we learned that there were ways to make it possible for more people than would normally come to have a nice time at our parks. And so we need to look at parks as a way of also helping people with coping on high heat days, which will be increasing over time. And I think that it's really important to also just be really specific about what's needed at individual parks. So there's no one size fits all for parks or for any type of waterfront infrastructure. The elevations are all different. The infrastructure is all different. So it's just a matter of being very specific about what's needed, working with the community, and making sure that our Parks Department is well funded.
Yeah, Rich, I'll just jump right in. I think, thanks, Courtney, for that. I agree with you 100%. I think a good example of how to integrate open space and parks into resilience at a community scale level would be the city of Hoboken. Dewberry had a chance to be involved in the Rebuild by Design project in Hoboken. I mean, Hoboken's a place that probably never should have been built if you had an eye on staying dry for the long term, but it was built essentially over a marsh. When Sandy came in, it came in and it got in from the south and the north like a double pincer movement, and it got behind the city and then moved in. Not necessarily from the waterfront in particular. And Hoboken is a place, just like many communities in New York City, where the real issue is not the big storms. I mean, those are an issue everywhere, but it's the nuisance flooding. It's the nor'easters that you're seeing 5 or 10 times a year. And, I mean, it's every couple of weeks you're hearing about Hoboken being flooded a few years ago from, severe rainstorms. So it's integrating, as Courtney suggested, parks into the overall resilience strategy of managing stormwater in particular. And how you can do that in a way where you can enjoy the recreation value that those parks give you, but at the same time, they can be used to store water. I mean, we've got a big challenge with combined sewers in this region, right? And it's great that, we can do things to help improve water quality. But if you have a big storm coming in, you're usually dumping raw sewage into the Hudson River and other places around the bay, and that's a big problem. So what you really want to do essentially is to use parks and other open space to help sort of delay and store, so that your wastewater treatment facilities can have the opportunity to treat all this incoming water, and then you designed it in a way that it's released to the wastewater treatment plants through the infrastructure in time, so that the big storm is past, the big demand for water treatment has passed, and now you can start releasing some of that excess water and get it treated to avoid these major water quality CSOs that we're trying to avoid. So I think that that's an important way of looking at parks, and I think Hoboken's a good example where they're in the process, and they have to some degree redesigned parks with resilience in mind, and that's a good place to look for some good examples.
Yeah, I'll add too that I think one of the areas that I think holds a lot of potential for helping to direct the most efficient investment dollars is really to be getting more sophisticated with respect to modeling more of these flash flooding types of events, and specifically understanding the way that water moves. And to your point, John and Courtney, about storing water or absorbing or sponge-like qualities of parks, is that a more effective investment than hardening certain assets in different ways that we've been doing? And it's particularly when you look at the frequency of the event and the relative damage that comes from each of these different types. I think there's a lot of room for learning more from the analytics and learning more from the modeling, and having that direct these very constrained dollars into the areas that are going to provide the most benefit, collectively, sort of from a broader standpoint. That's some work that HNTB has been doing in post Katrina Louisiana, really using modeling to be a driver of what are the types of measures that are most effective from the standpoint of being able to store water. Doing things like recreation facilities that double as flooding zones to contain water. But being smart about it from the analytics and from the very detailed modeling. So I see that as a very promising sort of avenue and a way to make sure that not only are we making good decisions today, but we have mechanisms to continue to just sort of evaluate those decisions that we're making, 3, 4, 5, 6 years down the road as patterns change, and make sure that we're still operating from the same value proposition.
Right. I think you hit on something very important here, which is that we have so many more tools at our disposal now to understand what future flooding, storm surges, other impacts might look like. And, the tools that were in place 10, 20 years ago just pale in comparison to the kind of thinking that we can do now. Courtney, I think you wanted to say something, so I'll pause there, but did want to underscore that point.
Yeah, well, just building off of that and what Sally said, also, I think that maybe partly what you're saying, Sally, too, is that there aren't a lot of simple answers, and that modeling and the analytics are critically important, especially in New York City. So for example, if you want to build or retrofit a park to be a sponge park, but it's near a subway line, that could have major implications for the way that the subway system is able to handle the water intake that's going down. So I think that this is just, again, like that this is a very changing dynamic situation. And so I think that the best in analytics and modeling, especially when it comes to the complexity of what's underground in New York City, is just absolutely critical for people to understand. And also, I think just one thing, just going back to what Rich, you were saying before, in terms of how we're understanding better what's happening and we have to change the way we think about it, is that it's almost like each hurricane over the last 10 years has been telling us something different about what hurricanes are able to do. So we don't talk a lot about Hurricane Isaias, which happened last summer, which didn't affect New York City so much, but was really devastating to some of the suburbs. It was a completely different type of hurricane, very, very high winds, very little precipitation, and the power outages, and most importantly, the internet outages all over, except for New York City, for the most part, was really devastating. So one of the things we also need to really look at in terms of resilience is our communications infrastructure. How prepared is our system to handle major impacts that could take down Wi-Fi and cell towers, and how does that affect our ways and our ability to communicate with each other, especially right after disaster? So I believe over time, we just really need to incorporate many more factors into what we consider to be climate resilience, and also look at all of the different characteristics of the storms that are coming through, because none of them are the same.
Continuing on the theme of everything is multivariable, right? And we can't win the next battle by fighting the last war, right? We have to learn, grow, learn, grow, and so on. I'd like to pivot us to thinking about these issues at a community level, and specifically low-income communities and communities of color. You know, it has been a centerpiece of the environmental justice community for decades now that these communities bear the disproportionate burden of emissions, toxic exposures, the impacts of our combustion, and everything we do to run our society. Now we're starting to learn that these same communities that bear the brunt of the emissions and toxic exposures are now facing disproportionate burdens as we think about flooding, future storms, and climate adaptation. And so can you share some insights about how do we integrate what we've learned about involving communities? John, you touched on this in your opening remarks, in terms of involving communities, especially underserved communities, early in the process, throughout the process, and even after the process, to make sure that their needs are best met.
Yeah, let me jump in with some ideas, Rich. First thing is, I think New York City did okay after Sandy with spreading the resources and the thinking about resilience to communities that that were underserved, or that were we all know about Lower Manhattan, right? The financial center of the world. Of course, everybody wants to run and protect Wall Street, but the city did a great job with looking at Red Hook. There's a significant effort made. Still haven't built a project. Of course, you haven't built one in Lower Manhattan yet either. Talk about it, East Side Coastal Resilience, the engineering's done, but the construction's just beginning. Red Hook's in the same place. There was some study in places like Coney Island also, which is, I think, an environmental justice community of concern. So I think that was, they did a good job looking at equity, resilience equity is what I like to call it. But I'd like to just offer a way of thinking about it. We've been doing engineering and architecture for a couple of centuries now. We figured out how to plan and build things. We know how to do it. Since 1970, thereabout, we know how to do environmental analysis, and we know how to look at environmental impacts. I mean, some might say the pendulum swung too far to one side. I think we need, so I mean, it's been 50 years since the environmental movement. So how about the community engagement movement? When are we going to start thinking of how we do community engagement in the same way as a practice, and how we can do it right, and how we can get better at it so we can be more inclusive, and not make that not make the plan going to communities because you have to, but make the plan going to communities and getting their feedback because that makes sense to build the best project and get the right results that the community is going to buy into. So I think we're starting to think about that. A good example of how to do that better is the Rebuild by Design program that came after Sandy, where really HUD and Sean O'Donovan in particular forced consultants on winning projects to really engage heavily with communities. And I think we learned that communities can provide the experts and the professionals with the right ideas to help shape projects in a way that's going to benefit obviously not the only community as a whole, but then bring the level of value of the project even further up and get it done, by the way, without significant opposition. So I think that Rebuild by Design program is a really good start and a model to to start. And then let's get into that deriving a real professional community practice and community engagement.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think that the tone is certainly being set at the top, right? With President Biden's very clear focus on equity and the nexus between the infrastructure investments and equity review and understanding of the value that that different communities will take from different types of investment. I know that is something that's certainly very near and dear to HNTB, and I'm sure to other firms as well. We have an entire portion of our leadership team that is devoted specifically to the nexus between infrastructure development and equity. And I think that this space is absolutely, one where we see that very clearly. I think I couldn't agree with you more, John, that community engagement is key. And community engagement, just like the discussion we just had around analytics and needing to keep your finger on the pulse and constantly be changing, it's constantly changing too, right? What are the most effective ways to gather that input? It's not a one-shot system, and what worked 5 years ago doesn't necessarily work now, right? So to build diverse teams, within our organizations to understand and represent the diversity of the city that we represent, I think is key. And to fashion community engagement programs that are multifaceted and multi-tiered to make sure that you're getting input from folks from a whole variety of mechanisms, and using that to think through explicitly the equity implications of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I can't agree more. This is so important. And I'll just build off of what John was saying. Also, I think part of what's so important about community work is that you learn what the issues are so much better when you hear from the community what their lived experience is of what's happening. They have the understanding, the knowledge, their ears to the ground. And so it's not only about getting input and working on community buy-in, et cetera, but it's really about you will do better work if you really understand to much more of a fine detail how people are experiencing what they're experiencing. And that's just really, really important.
So we're running a little bit towards the end of the hour. I'm hoping maybe we can stay on a couple extra minutes because we do have some questions in the chat that I want to get to. I do want to, before we turn over to those questions, I want to ask just a quick lightning round, if I may, of advice you would give to either the new governor, the incoming mayor, or the incoming council, or if you want to look south to the to Congress and the White House as they consider the various packages they're considering. Lightning round, 1-2 sentences, not more, and then I'll go to the Q&A.
My comment would be don't get so concerned about who gets the credit. Serve the community regardless of the political value. Do the right thing.
Mine is that the next mayor and the next governor of New York need to work in Washington, D.C. to make sure that our region gets the funding that it should from Congress. You have to have really good teams in D.C. So fund those offices, send your staff to D.C., make them comfortable, and have them do great work.
Sally?
My advice is that we need to envision what it is we want, and then think about the best and most effective way of getting there. And I agree that means that it's a combination of mobilizing at the federal level, and it's also thinking cross-jurisdictionally and across assets. How do we get to a system that delivers for the residents of this area and the businesses of this area in a way that's commensurate with the opportunity and power of New York City?
Great. So I'm going to turn to the Q&A now. We've got a number of questions. Some are similar. We could do a little bit of cutting and pasting and combining. We have some questions that really ask about the challenge of building a resilient waterfront when there are conflicting jurisdictional issues. There are references to Manhattan's west side and the Hudson River Park geography. There are references to the Seaport and Financial District. There are references to the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project, but I think there's a commonality of thoughts on how to navigate the multi-jurisdictional aspects of all these to get to the goals that we're all talking about.
Well, I think that's a, oh, sorry, Courtney.
Yeah, go ahead, Sally, you take it. Go first. That's a tough one.
Well, I think it is a tough one, right? It's absolutely a tough one because, organizations, jurisdictions, agencies are set up, with long histories and very full plates, frankly. And so I think, though, you hit on it earlier, we are at a point of administration changeover across the board, essentially, and have the opportunity to take a new look at some of these. Some of them are longstanding needs and crises, but some of them are really, I think, have a much sharper point on them right now. And I certainly think the impacts of Ida have brought, brought flooding and the impacts of coastal resiliency just right up to the forefront of the dialogue again. So I think now is an opportunity to bring these new forces together and to again focus on the key issues and what it is we're trying to achieve, and then create the system to effectuate that change behind it.
Well, I guess, looking at Lower Manhattan and the East Side Coastal Resilience and the LMCR, Lower Manhattan Coastal Resilience with Battery Parks, trying to do, first takeaway is this is an ultra complex problem to solve. I did say there was a huge need for ribbon cuttings, but to the credit, it's been 9 years, but there's a lot of engineering that now is finally done. So I'm expecting to see some, in 9 years from now, if we were to do this again, Rich, I think we'd be celebrating some pretty fantastic projects, some in that area. Looking at one of the questions, it takes us time nothing happens fast, and it shouldn't. So I think if you try too fast to get a project done, you probably are not going to have a good project that's going to be accepted by the community. And then you have all the alphabet soup of agencies you got to work through. So I think we've learned a lot in this 9 years. And I think ESCR in particular, I think the way that project is shaped now is much better than it was shaped a few years ago. And I think that's a credit to the agency and to the team that's working on that project and the absolute need to change the basic design that went into that to allow the barrier to be further back in order to achieve a lot of the community's goals at that place, for instance. So I am excited that in 9 years, we all have to be patient and we can cross our fingers so we don't have another big storm, that we're going to have some marvelous projects that are going to be on the cover of, who knows, Resilience Digest someday. And we're celebrating what New Yorkers have brought to themselves as models for the world.
Let me jump in here and ask, what's the time frame we should be building for? Is it 25 years, 50, 100? And then also, let me just throw in, just to combine some questions, the extent to which, or the prioritization of efforts to reduce hard surfaces. I know we've talked a little bit about that in the parks context and some other contexts. I'll put those together.
the length, I'll let John will know much more detail on this, but I would just say sometimes the length of time just depends on how much you're able to invest and the risk you're willing to take in terms of the potential loss of your asset if you're designing for a shorter time frame. So, for example, at a park, if you're designing a new bathroom facility or something like that, and you know that it wouldn't survive a certain type of storm that we're most likely to have in 20 years, or it won't deal well with sea level rise in 20 years. Well, does that mean you don't build a bathroom facility? It probably means you build something that you know is just not going to last that long, but you still provide that asset because there's still 20 years of good use of that facility at that park. So I think you have to really look at it in terms of the life of the project.
Courtney, I was impressed. I think you hit it right on the nose, to be honest with you. I would answer the question in one sentence to say, the horizon needs to, your planning horizon needs to equal or exceed the useful life of the project at the very least. And that tends to be about 20 to 30 years. But push it out as far as you can, depending on what you can afford. The other thing I would say, I guess in two sentences now, would be, there's going to be adjacent projects, and they're going to be asking the same question. So there has to be collaboration between projects that are adjacent to make sure that, that horizon makes sense across the whole duration of projects.
We're getting towards the end here. I'm just going to flip through these one last time. And I think there is a question that we haven't tackled yet, which has to do with highly constrained places like the seaport and the financial district. Tactics like delay and store and some of the others that we've talked about are really for much less space constrained geographies. What are your thoughts on how we best protect the super high density urban environments that simply don't have space? And let's be quick because we're towards the end and maybe there's one or two more questions coming in.
My answer is like 3 words, like we need to do modeling and analytics to figure out what to do best. And I think that's what the city's doing. So that's my answer basically.
I would say it's a matter of figuring out how to route the water versus necessarily how to store it or how to block it. But again, I couldn't agree more. It's about the analytics and the modeling and figuring out how the water moves and then the most effective mitigation strategies.
Yeah, I would agree, Rich. I think that's a good answer. Just keep us moving.
So there's one last question, which brings us out of the topic of adaptation and into the topic of how do we rethink some of our transportation systems to reduce the amount of driving. The specific question was about getting rid of publicly subsidized parking in various locations, whether it's NYCHA buildings or otherwise, frankly. But I think it's a broader question, which is maybe a good way to end up the conversation, which is thoughts that each of you may have about particular carbon reduction strategies that you might be working on that you might want to share with folks.
I could start. I think, look, I think all of these issues are really complex, and there's a lot of nuance to every single question. Generally speaking, as a transit advocate, I am in favor of measures that incentivize mass transit use, that create spaces for buses to move at higher speeds on streets, that create the sorts of transit systems that are reliable and frequent and that are attractive to people to use. That said, there are certainly equity implications to focused decisions about where and how parking is removed, and those things need to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. I will say that we know that there's an ongoing conversation right now around congestion pricing in this city, and it shows how many different opinions there are, and how lively that discussion has been. Even though I think that there are, there's a lot of people who see the tremendous benefit on the big picture of what congestion pricing can deliver. There's still a lot of nuance and a lot of issues that arise as part of that discourse. And I think that's indicative of the broader conversation around some of these efforts that are really around driving the types of behavior that we'd like to see. There are absolutely short-term pains to some of these broader policies. I think that they're necessary. I think these policies are good policies, and I think we need to be moving in that direction. And I think there's opportunities to look at some of these more specific questions and come up with a more nuanced approach, but one that certainly moves in the direction of moving away from fossil fuels and getting people into more sustainable modes of transportation.
Yeah, I would agree, Rich. I think this disincentivization of driving as best you can, but you have to offer a safe, reliable transit system as an alternative, safe, reliable, and clean. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And secondly, this idea of electrification, of vehicle electrification, which, by the way, the electrification of New York and America is going to present other challenges, but it's going to help us with weaning off of fossil fuels. So that's a great. I think there's a lot of momentum in that direction.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say is just that it's so important that we stop burning fossil fuels. I just never want the conversation about preparing for climate change to eclipse that important point. And yes, it's baked in, but it could get much worse. So we must end the burning of fossil fuels, period.
Well, that's a good way to wrap up, maybe even tee up a future New York webinar on getting off of fossil fuels and reducing our carbon and other emissions. For now, though, I want to thank each of you for this conversation. It's been lively. It's been thought-provoking. I've really enjoyed it. I hope that all of our many participants out there have also enjoyed it. If you ask questions, I hope you got the answers you were hoping for, and to provoke and prod further thought. Please think about this, everybody, as the start of a conversation, not necessarily the end of the conversation. If topics came up today you want to learn more about, reach out to any of us. You can find us all easily through LinkedIn. You can find us easily through our places of employment. If there are ways that you'd like to work together, let's work together. We're all trying to row this boat in a direction towards a better future for New York, and we'd love to do it with you. Thank you for your time this morning, and enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Courtney. Thanks, Rich. Thanks, Capalino.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.